I assume that when you read the title of my lecture, Wrestling with Philosophy, you had immediately some kind of reaction to it. It might have been confusion. You may wonder whether I'm using a metaphor or I want to talk about wrestling. It might have been rejection. You may think of televised forms of wrestling as a spectacle and reject any relation of philosophizing with such a portrayal of physical strength and violence. It might also have been some kind of sympathy. You may think of the many hours you wrestled with complex philosophical thoughts or texts. This last reaction was mine when I first encountered Mbër, champion wrestler, in a corpus of Wolof texts from the 19th and 20th century. I thought of how fitting a metaphor it would be to think of philosophizing as wrestling. The verb to wrestle, as the German verb ringen or the Wolof bëre, refers to a physical activity in which one tries to wrestle an opponent to the ground, and also to the cognitive endeavor of wrestling with a problem or a difficulty. For me, wrestling in this sense is appealing and speaks to some experiences in the context of philosophy. I'm sure you are familiar with the exhaustion after writing down sometimes only one paragraph of your thoughts. I am certain that you remember the last time you wrestled with a text, when you were absolutely eager to squeeze out this specific idea or that precise concept. In opposition to fight or combat, there's a semantic connotation of endurance in wrestling. Wrestling does not refer to the moment in time in which you beat your opponent or solve the problem. It draws attention to the action of grappling, struggling, getting to a grip. And yes, philosophizing can be a strenuous effort. In this lecture, I propose to read selected Wolof texts by taking Mbër, the champion wrestler, as a point of departure. Next to showing that texts use this concept, I aim at gaining a deeper understanding of what the figure of Mbër signifies for the understanding of philosophy or of a philosopher. In the course of the lecture, I will show that the concept Mbër serves quite a different function from my first associations. The closer study of these texts transformed my understanding of the concept and taught me some lessons about intercultural philosophy. My lecture is a journey through the following arguments that I want to display here briefly without going into detail. Engaging with one another is crucial for philosophizing. Philosophizing in a globalized world means to train one's capacities to enable engagement. Praising can be an act of philosophizing. In the context of philosophy, praising acknowledges one's own indebtedness to others and discusses their philosophical contribution. In the Wolof text I present here, Mbër acknowledges someone's capacity to transform others in multiple ways. Mbër illustrates the multi-layered, culturally grounded nature of philosophical discourse. To me, philosophizing in Wolof means to cultivate my capacity to engage with others, for example, in paying attention, reading, observing, and moving. Before I delve deeper into this line of argumentation, I want to give you some background information. First, on the language Wolof. Wolof is spoken mainly in Senegal, in the Gambia, and in southern Mauritania, thus 3 West African countries. There are important diaspora communities in Italy, France, and the US. In Senegal, Wolof is the language of everyday communication, even though it's not an official language. The only official language of Senegal is French. Also some background on wrestling. Wrestling is Senegal's national sport. Dominique Chevet and Cheikh Tidiane Ouane use Husserl's concept of Lebenswelt to talk about wrestling in Senegal, meaning that la lutte est une manière de vivre, un vécu, un engagement dans l'existence, un sol originaire qui nourrit et permet que se développe toute une pratique complexe. As I did here, I will always pronounce the original text and not the translation, unless you tell me you can't read. Or can't read it. So this life world of wrestling is a male-dominated world. With the exception of the Jola in southern Senegal, women wrestlers are marginal and marginalized in Senegal. And after my lecture, we may want to talk about Mbër Mujigéen in the philosophical sense, so women wrestlers in Senegal in the philosophical sense. And a last context regarding history. One could say that Senegal appeared on the political maps through the Jolof Empire. In the period of its widest expansion, the 15th century, the empire was composed arguably of 6 states, of which 4 were Wolophone: Jolof, Waalo, Kajoor, and Baol. It's in the 15th century that the first Europeans also arrived in Senegal. Colonial powers that had been present in contemporary Senegal include Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French. Up to the 19th century, as Usman Khan explained last week, the colonial presence was, however, limited to harbors at the Atlantic shore. So, for instance, Saint Louis, Rufisque, or Gorée. Now, my first context is 16th to 17th century Senegal. One of the first known philosophers in Wolof language is Kocc Barma Fall. Kocc Barma lived in the kingdom of Kajoor in central Senegal, estimatedly from 1584 to 1654. He is remembered for his sayings and symbolic acts. While some sources speak of up to 5,000 sayings that Kocc coined, others argue that only 4 sayings can be certainly attributed to the philosopher. In any case, sayings and stories attributed to Kocc Barma Fall continue to inspire philosophical reflection until today. This may be attributed to their direct intelligibility with the experience of everyday life. In this sense, the philosopher Kocc inspired a comparative essay comparing Kocc to Johann Gottfried Herder. The Senegalese scholar Khady Fall argues, Herder wie Kocc geht es darum herauszufinden, wie der Mensch aufgrund einer zunehmenden Humanisierung durch Bildung und Erziehung seinen Platz als Vertreter des Göttlichen auf der Erde verdienen könne. In her essay, Khady Fall points to the prominent place of reflections on education and personhood, the idea of becoming a person through education in Kocc Barma's sayings, and arguably for philosophizing in Wolof more generally. This line of argumentation has been also developed by other Senegalese philosophers. I'm mainly thinking here of Assane Sylla's work on la philosophie morale de Wolof, where he talked about the notion of person, nit, and non-person, nitodi. So one gains personhood by acting morally and ethically responsible. However, today my subject is different. So was Kocc Barma Fall a wrestler? Kocc dedicated large parts of his life to the definitions of the boundaries of royal power. Through his sayings, symbols, and political engagement, Kocc is said to have opposed Daoudemba, who abused of his royal powers. As a politician, Kocc had first helped this Daoudemba to access power, When the latter aimed at making his power absolute and ruled in a scrupulous manner, Koch opposed him in multiple ways. Abdul Jai therefore writes about Koch as a fighter. Son combat fut un combat d'arrière-garde pour l'autonomie des pouvoirs locaux à l'égard de l'omnipotence royale. En ce sens, ses résultats devaient à la longue s'estomper. C'est pourquoi peut-être la tradition, l'histoire, n'a conservé que le souvenir de maître à penser de tout un peuple. This analysis is interesting. It seems that Koch Barma Fall wrestled with power through the means of philosophizing, meaning criticizing royal power here. However, Jai differentiates between the thinker on the one hand and the activist on the other. Koch is merely remembered as a thinker, not as the one interested in limiting royal power or pushing for institutional reforms. So this is a case of a philosopher being politically active. But is it an example of a wrestling philosopher? Are wrestler, bëre, and fighter, combattant, the same things? If they are different concepts, was Koch Barma Fall a wrestler? So for this answer, you have to wait until the end of this lecture. But now I need to tell you what Mbër signifies in Wolof text, and so I need to jump to the 19th century. My search and interest in the concept Mbër began with Ganar, a text composed by Samba Jarambai. Samba Jarambai lived from 1870 to 1917 and is known for his poetic production in Wolof. Ganar is an epic poem that deals with the exile of Amadou Bamba in Mauritania. Before I come to Bamba, let me speak a little bit about this context again. At that time, the Wolof kingdoms are succumbing to different pressures. A first pressure is exercised by the French colonial expansion. As mentioned earlier, for about 400 years, the colonial presence had been limited to coastal Senegal. Only from the mid-19th century, the French colonists embarked on a conquest of the whole territory of Senegal, and only from 1890 we can speak of an assimilationist colonization implemented through direct rule. While the French conquest was met with resistance, the Wolof kingdoms are eventually defeated. A second pressure for the Wolof elite is a challenging of power from within. Until the 19th century, one could speak of a balance of power between the rulers of the Wolof kingdom and marabouts, the Muslim religious leaders. Either marabouts lived in villages with their followers and did not interfere with power, or they were associated to the rulers and served as court secretaries, enabling correspondence within the Wolof Empire and towards other kingdoms in the Arabic language. Islam and Islamic education at this time were an elite project. So one of these associated marabouts was Mam Mor Anta Salim Bakke, and his son Amadou Bamba disagreed with his father's alignment with power and with such a coalition of rulers and intellectual elites. Amadou Bamba founded the Brotherhood of the Mouridiyya, which promotes an education based on a faithful adherence to the model of life of one's spiritual guide. Bamba himself wrote on various topics of Islamic scholarship and remains best known for his emphasis on work and industriousness. This Bamba now instructed Samba Jarambai, the author of our text, to write in Wolof to disseminate his teachings in the language of the people. The choice of using Wolof was Bamba's means to popularize Islam and found an Islam of, by, and for the people. Thus, our author, Samba Jarambai, who had studied only in Arabic, needed to write, think, and teach in Wolof. This act of translation is inscribed in the name of this literature until today. Wolofal means rendering Wolof. The epic poem discussed here evokes Amadou Bamba's exile in Mauritania. Amadou Bamba's Reformation attempts were critically viewed by established Islamic scholars. They succeeded in convincing the French colonial authorities of Bamba's dangerousness, leading to a first exile in Gabon and a second exile in Mauritania. Ganar praises Bamba in the specifically difficult situation of the exile and isolation. Each of the 27 chapters of the poem has a different theme. I will focus on chapter 12, where the major references to wrestling are to be found. And I wanted to make you listen to it, but maybe it's not working. We didn't try. So I will offer you to listen tomorrow. In chapter 12, the arrival of Amadou Bamba in the Mauritanian exile is understood as an arrival of a Mbër, a champion wrestler, and preparations for a lamb, a wrestling match, soon begin. Ñu xeyla jinale ak ay mbër yu lukiku yuy dañoo uban seeni mbër ba weti Ganaar. Ñu gaawte wax leen ni kooki mu ubale ba upp waa yetti xibla yi. Tey jaaxal na Ganaar. Ñu daldi composé tey xas daldi wax ni bu leen yàggal di may mbër lu muy def ndam fa Ganaar. Ganaar ba Ganaar ga jeex. Def leen di moytu ba woon ba tey ku dul ñoom du leen serfal fa Ganaar. Thus, the beginning of the chapter describes Amadou Bamba, spiritual guide and revolutionary, in terms of a wrestler or wrestling champion. The Mauritanians prepared to engage with him in a wrestling match. In the end of the chapter, it becomes, however, clear that this understanding of Bamba as a Mbër, aiming to enter a lamb, a wrestling arena, is a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the situation. Samba Jarambai clearly states, Fugras ya aksi di khas, bohun hamula ka'ai. They think you are coming to fight. How is ignorance disgraceful? The ignorance evoked here refers to an ignorance to learn and to be transformed from the exiled Amadou Bamba. He should not be fought against, but be followed in his teaching. So Samba Jarambai continues, Xam-xam lun koy doye, bo jachlen gerlan ga xam, te lachi xamkat bu fi labire Ganaar. Dana yegal tuuti ñi lay sooru waxtu fi am maana faful bari tey leeral ba Ganaar te tey ma bakkala lool man Samba ma la ko laal te tey ma déggal ko ñi ak ñaafa Ganaar ku déglu bañ moo sonal boppam ku déglu tayem noppal na boppam ne yaay ub lambi Ganaar. While the Mauritanians prepared to engage with the Senegalese spiritual leader in a wrestling match, they are mistaken to do so. Samba Jarambai invites them to learn from his guide Amadou Bamba. For Bamba has acquired profound knowledge, and therefore any further competition is unnecessary. Bamba not only denounced the intertwinement of intellectual elite and political power, he also rejected the focus on theoretical instruction in Islamic education and advocated for a more holistic approach to education, tarbiyya. This holistic approach seeks to transform the whole being by touching the body, the mind, and the soul. It does so primarily through a distinct relation of spiritual guide and murid, aspirant. The murid surrenders himself to the spiritual guide and thereby to God. Thus, the teaching of Bamba is centered on a multidimensional followership, comprehending all areas of life. This aspect becomes very clear in the final stanzas of chapter 12, displayed here. In this stanza, a personal quest for ham, knowledge, which she refuses instead to acknowledge the guide's knowledge and teaching, means to lead a restless life. To surrender to a guide and guidance may bring peace of mind. As our author, Samba Jarambai, has surrendered to his guide, Bamba, to live, learn, and be transformed, others could do. Honestly, this practice and way of life seems strange for me, philosophizing in Hildesheim in 2025. Am I not here to critically interrogate, to question, to speak? Well, hopefully, we are also here to engage with one another, to read, to listen, to observe. And indeed, this last formulation of Samba Jarambai speaks to me in multi-layered ways. Kudeklu bany mo sonal bopam, kudeklu tayem, nopal na bopam ne yai ublambi ganar. Who listens to refuse may tire himself, who listens to accept may appease himself, for it is you who has closed the arenas of Mauritania. Listening is of course constitutional for philosophizing, not only for philosophizing, for any communicative encounter. Without the capacity to listen, there's only noise. This is particularly so for philosophy. Only if we are ready to observe, listen, learn, accept, and comprehend, we may enter the philosophical dialogue or polylogue. In Samba Jarambai's conceptualization, one can be transformed if one listens, learns, and accepts. The wrestling arena is formed by those watching. When this circle disperses, the fight will not take place. In this sense, the ignorance coupled with preparing a wrestling match may be disgraceful, while listening and following the knowledge may be graceful. Thus, let me remind you of my first argument. Engaging with one another is crucial for philosophizing. That means paying close attention, relearning to read, listen, and observe. Philosophizing in a globalized world means to cultivate and train these capacities. Samba Jarambai stated that ignorance is disgraceful, knowledge is graceful. But what is the nature of knowledge? Knowledge, can only be obtained with and alongside others. Our task cannot be to wrestle against, but with each other, to pay close attention and to listen and learn to obtain knowledge. This knowledge may give us peace, calm, guidance. Geobo tacho, boba geotas, ganya ham nakote, lambër yi fi deti helumu sufa ganar. Fugras ya aksidi khas, bohun hamulaka ay, hamnani te la geo by tas faganar. Sawet gite kumujay, bal koka heidi la dap. Galaj gatochna, taken mim til faganar, kumim najuk daldi jel walam. Kuham limaham nayem, kurer te madal koi wach figanar. We are reading together parts of an Islamic poem, but we are also confronted with a source of philosophizing. I am not here to wrestle you to the ground, neither are you. I would hope to contribute to a world in which we reach out to each other in solidarity and as fellow humans. I would like to connect to a knowledge that leads to a positive transformation in me and in others. I began this lecture with a free association to the concept of wrestling in regards to philosophical practice. I connected it to actions such as grappling, struggling, getting to a grip. But philosophizing can also be acknowledgement, listening, understanding, acceptance. Kucham limacham nayem. Who knows what I know? It is enough. To understand what wrestling/philosophizing is, we may turn our gaze away from the arena and take a look inside of us. What kind of knowledge transforms us in positive ways? What kind of practices let us enter a conversation on eye level? Another point is crucial for me in reading the poem. The posture of this poem is humble. The author is praising someone else for his accomplishments. When we organized a workshop in March, one of our colleagues, Simpiwe Sesanti, stood up several times to praise. He said that critique was also positive critique. And he is so right. There are some things we easily forget in philosophizing. Praising, lauding, to say, you know, you inspired me. Thus, my second argument is, praising can be an act of philosophizing. In the context of philosophy, praising is a form of critique that acknowledges one's own indebtedness to others. This kind of praise is rooted in a cultivated practice of engagement with one another. If you want, you could read the text Ganare as a form of praise poetry. He pays tribute to his spiritual, intellectual, and life master, Amadou Bamba. It is in this context that the concept of a wrestling champion is employed. In the Wolof texts I present here, Mbër acknowledges someone's capacity to transform the writer. Well, so far I showed that an Islamic poem of colonized Senegal refers to a spiritual guise as a Mbër, a wrestling champion. I try to make sense of it, speaking from my own situatedness here in Hildesheim. You may rightly ask, however, what the older text has to do with contemporary efforts to philosophize in Wolof. Let me try to give you an answer by moving to the context of post-independence Senegal. The third historical context is about 100 years later, the 1980s. You may have heard of Cheikh Anta Diop. Internationally, he is mainly known for his Afrocentric work on ancient Egypt, published, for example, in his monograph Nations, Nègres et Culture, Negro Nations and Culture. Diop was an interdisciplinary scholar who was interested in mathematics, chemistry, and physics next to philosophy, Egyptology, and history. In Senegal, Diop is also remembered among the leaders of the institutional opposition to the first president of independent Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor. Senghor, famous as being the poet-president, his language of poetic expression was French. The philosophical thought of Senghor deserves a separate lecture, but he has little place in a lecture concerned with philosophizing in Wolof. Cheikh Anta Diop's visions could and are studied in a philosophical perspective. However, most of his works are also written in French. But through his activism, he motivated others to write, do research, and philosophize in Wolof. After Cheikh Anta Diop's death in 1986, a collection of obituaries in poetic form was published, entitled Sargal Cheikh Anta Diop, Woy ci Lamiñu Wolof, praising Cheikh Anta Diop, poems in Wolof language. Poetic form as a means of expression continues to play a crucial role in 20th century Senegal, as it does today. When one looks at these texts, there are some striking continuities from the 19th century Wolof text to the 20th century Wolof text. And as a first example, I want to show you a text by Papa Ndiaye, Nyel Cheikh Anta Diop, returning to Cheikh Anta Diop. Mo festel ak in gënel te ñak lol kanyan di géejuk xam-xam ku ñëw duy ba feesal naan Cheikh Anta. Kenn la fi woon te dootu fi am, woyof tool ci nit ñi te diis gan ak xam-xam. La Baay Musa waxoon, Mbër ma yelloo na ko, xaalimam du jum du jaax, rafet la na ko, am xelam du gàkk du naax, mu sell upp xam-xam, seex géej la, te duusu dongo yaay dëtëm. In this poem, the author praises and gives importance to Cheikh Anta Diop. He does so through a direct reference to an older poem by the author Moussa Ka, in which the later praises Amadou Bamba. The very Amadou Bamba Samba Diarra Mbaye praised in the poem Ghana. So you see the formulations in quotation marked. Through the intertextual reference, the author attributes to Cheikh Anta similar importance as to Amadou Bamba. As Moussa Ka praised Amadou for being a faultless example as a teacher and scholar, so praises Papa Ndiaye Cheikh Anta Diop. Both are marked by their ham-ham, their knowledge, meaning knowledge as vast as the sea. The student is willing to be transformed by the master's wisdom, by washing himself from the outside and inside, striving for some sort of intellectual purity. Papa Ndiaye writes of Cheikh Anta Diop as a Mbër, a champion wrestler, a champion of scholarship that needs to be praised. These lines demonstrate that the Wolofal texts are not reducible to the religious realm. The Wolofal texts are a living practice that offer a frame of reference, a frame of world interpretation. They are aesthetic works encoding knowledge and philosophical reflection beyond the immediate spiritual meaning. Or better, there is no cultivation of mind that does not encompass all areas of human activities, thus includes spirituality, treatment of those surrounding you, economical activities, and political action. Just to recall my argument, praising can be an act of philosophizing. In the Wolof text I present here, Mbër acknowledges someone's capacity to transform others in multiple ways. In the same collection, two further pieces refer to wrestling. I want to show you one last example, namely Moussa Gueye's poem Jalben, The Beginning. Cheikh Mbër ma xas na ba tay, ba yëf ya soof ko mu wey, fa nu jaaroon di ko dingat, ñu jaar faram di ko woy tey. It is a poetic text that can be interpreted in several ways. Who are those passing on their knees today when they contested Cheikh Anta Diop yesterday? Some politico-intellectual enemies might use the moment of death to appropriate the memory for their own projects. This is at least what Nyonzer would say of Leopold Sédar Senghor's honoring of Cheikh Anta Diop in the journal Éthiopique, making Diop an ally in negritude. Cheikh Anta sakina tey, buur bi ko mayoon jogu fi ca Adamak Awaja. Fu mbër tere, mbër jokk yàgg na, te fu mbër jàng buur yàllay taxaw. Here now we are confronted with a supernatural, a divine source of philosophizing. The place of learning for great wrestlers is God. The reference to Adam and Eve can be also read as a reference to Abrahamic religions. Actually, the word for human in Wolof commonly used is Domu Adama, the child of Adam. But don't we as philosophers have to look at everything critically, and especially an idea of God or a spiritual force as the eternal source of knowledge? Well, I promised in the beginning that I would come back to Kochbar Mafal. Do you still remember the quotation I showed? This quote is the first part, or part of my first part of the answer. For philosophers everywhere, the divine and the spiritual are the backdrop to their reflection. These ideas of divine and spiritual are often rooted in language and culture we use. Intercultural philosophy may allow us to see our own frames of reference in contact with the frame of reference of others, but only if we listen attentively and are allowing to be transformed by knowledge. The second part of the answer I want to give through a story that is often used to illustrate Koch's way of living and philosophizing. When the ruler wanted to kill Koch for his disrespect, Koch trapped the ruler when he was going to take a bath and pretended to be God. He not only spoke as God, but attacked the ruler with a cord. The next morning, the ruler forgives Koch, and the following dialogue is recorded. Kochne mo damel luladalfi, Moniko, fofo lama iala Japon, Moniko, falna ialamel, Moniko iala de Mbërla, mom kumui jappe legin gade. Thus, God is Mbër. Amadou Bamba is Mbër. Cheikh Anta Diop is Mbër. And Kochbar Mafal is Mbër. And whoever is Mbër, a wrestling champion, may be praised. But well, a blind praise of someone might just be a mistake. Instead of listening and learning from Koch, the ruler thought he could get rid of him in direct confrontation and kill him. This is not what the philosophical wrestling is all about. Mbër is used in these texts as an expression acknowledging someone's capacities. These capacities go beyond what we may call intellectual capacities, but regard all aspects of life. It exceeds the idea of a role model and acknowledges learning as a transformative endeavor. This brings me to my last two statements. Mbër illustrates the multi-layered, culturally grounded nature of philosophical discourse. Studying Wolof philosophical discourse means to pay close attention to the multiple layers of meaning encoded in expressions, gestures, or texts. To me, philosophizing in Wolof means to cultivate my capacity to encounter others, to pay attention, to read, to listen, to observe, and to move. The encounter with Wolof text challenges me and my understanding of philosophy. In this sense, I am wrestling with philosophy. And I also want to give praise to Abibatu Jiang, who helped me with the translation of the abstract into Wolof, but especially to Usman Khan, who very patiently corrected my translation of Wolof into English. For commenting on the draft to Claudia Favarato, Eileen Jahn, Saskia Jacek, und Emiliano Minerva, and for all those continuing the conversation, and of course to you for being such an attentive audience. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monika, for this interesting insight into a selected couple of texts of the huger corpus of texts in Wolof with philosophical relevance. Thank you so much. So the floor is open for comments and questions. We always say students first, right? If there are questions from
and there are really no dumb questions. I know I bombarded you with a lot of things.
It's very specific, but if you have questions, please, everything's welcome. Okay, if not, then Professor Kahn.
Thank you very much, Monika, for this lecture. You know, being a Wolof speaker, I learned a lot from this lecture because I never thought about Mbër, you know, as the way that you presented or you felt or understood it. I didn't understand Mbër in that way. So I know that they often use the term jambar, meaning brave, in Wolof. But what I see is that in all these poems that you presented, they use the term Mbër for what I thought would be only jambar. So that was very insightful for me. Now, could you give us a little bit more background about the main protagonist in this arena, you know, of in the poem Gannar? Who are the main protagonists? Because when you say Mbër, means wrestling, and meaning that there is one, obviously it is clear that Bamba is a champion, you know, he would defeat all opponents. But I wanted to understand who are the potential opponents, the people who denounced Bamba to the French who deported him, other scholars who may claim to be knowledgeable more than Bamba, Mauritanians some of whom might have looked down upon Bamba because he's a black. So I want to understand who are the main protagonists of Mbër in that sense, in the sense of wrestling really. Why does Bamba excel compared to who and who and who? So maybe I would stop here and so that I give the floor to others. But I have other questions. Or let me just start with let me the second question, and I promise that I won't ask for the floor again. So it's about language. Ahmadou Bamba was very learned in Arabic. He, as you explained, instructed his disciple Samba Diarra Mbaye to write in French, in Wolof, in Wolofal, and Samba Diarra knew Arabic. Moussa Ka, also another of his disciples, knew Arabic but wrote in Wolof. Mor Ndiaye Kairé is another one. And thinking about the argument of Fallou Ngom in his book about the role that Wolofal played in the development of the Mouridia. So why would these people write only in Wolof? Maybe we should ask them the question. But and because this also challenged the notion of language hierarchy in the study of Islamic erudition, the notion that it's only Arabic which is important or at the top and the other languages are not important. Yeah, so I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much for both these questions and comments. And I think we will also continue the conversation. For the most part, the last two groups you mentioned are part of this arena. So on the one hand, like knowledgeable scholars, so it's a lot about the knowing, but very importantly also the Mauritanians. And I have to say, in this sense, I find this poem also very difficult because it portrays also, like it's very much against the Mauritanians. And I was now also thinking this morning, why? If it is because, as a response to some thinking of racial superiority, or if it's not also a historical explanation. So also the roots being in Mauritania, also for the parts of the family of, for instance, Sheikh Amadou Bamba, and then returning there, and maybe also this circular movement. I was freely associating, but I think that's very interesting how the Mauritanians are displayed in this poetry, and this is, I think, also like should be part of a different investigation, because I also don't know how it's in other places, because as you explained, the Islamic archive that had all these connections to like go against this in such a manner is also interesting, right? And of course it's about also how the Muridiya presents itself, right? And I think that's what I sometimes find difficult also working with there's a lot of scholarship published, right, by the Muridiya about this Wolofal poetry and the history of Amadou Bamba, but it also wants to tell us a certain story at times. I find the argument of Falun Gong convincing. I think there's one part, of course, of one can say popularize, like change, reform Islam, but I think it might also just be so because I was raised as a Lutheran Christian, and it's a very similar story, right, of like the history of German is also connected to the translation of the Bible into German, and of course the effect of like constituting like German also as such a language was not intended, I think, but it's of course as how we today like read history, right? So in some way for me this sounds very familiar of translating something into the language of the people, maybe the language of their everyday, and thereby elevating also this language. So I think maybe I'm just reading it through my lens, but I'm happy to continue the conversation, because I think what we have talked about last week is, of course, it's a profound transformation that takes place, right? And there are new concepts emerging when we translate from Arabic to Wolof, right? And it's also a creative process. And so what should we do now with this? And I think I showed like one aspect of this creative process, because I don't know, or you tell me if I'm wrong, that wrestling is the category that Arabic scholarship would work with, right? Or speak of an arena, yeah. Yeah, but yeah, thank you very much for your comments.
Okay, I have two more questions now, Wolf and then Isolde.
Yeah, Monika, thank you very much for this interesting insight into the translational process, but also picking up the metaphor of the wrestler and wrestling. And I have one comment and one very small question. My comment is the place where philosophizing took place in ancient Greek was the place of the wrestlers, the gymnasion. Mm-hmm. And they wrestled naked. And then the sophists and those who try to argue with each other went to that place and took over the place, which is now the gymnasium. And so, do you see a relation with this ancient Greek tradition? Because one of the founding activities within or in connection to philosophy is wrestling, and there is an agonal character of philosophy, like to be controversies, to fight out controversies in philosophy. And my question would be, your title is Wrestling with Philosophy. Could you also say wrestling as philosophy?
That doesn't surprise me. You know, when I came across this concept or like this word, it was really more a puzzlement. I was like, what is happening here? And the more I delve into it, like the more I dig deeper, I see many kinds of connections. One issue is, of course, the issue of embodiment. And I think like reading is the Wolofal text of Sufi tradition without understanding this notion that Ham is always also embodied, right? It's not something up here or out there. It's just a very, very limiting reading. So I think that it's very interesting if you think back to Greece as well, and I like to think about it in maybe also a comparative manner of the wrestling. And I said that I'm talking from my situatedness, and there I'm wrestling with philosophy, also coming from the non-embodied practice, or if you want, or embodied practice, but with no experience of wrestling as a sport. What was very interesting for me is when I discussed this text with peers, one Saskia, I learned that she was wrestling. And she even said I should like go much further, because for her, wrestling is not at all about the fight, right? It's, she said, well, it's more like dancing. It's a lot about engaging with each other. And so I have the feeling the deeper I dig, the more convincing I would say philosophizing as wrestling. Yeah.
Sol and then Leon.
Yes, thank you. Well, just took away one question of mine. I was just going to just ask about the Greek wrestling tradition, but then another question maybe toward the concept of wrestling in Wolofal tradition. Is there a special kind of wrestling which is specific to that tradition? You were speaking of the ritual context, maybe the praising and those elements. Are those coded as cultural specific elements of that wrestling tradition? That's one question. The second question is rather simple because I'm just interested to know how the word ham actually works. So what is the etymology of that? It looks also very interesting because it says one part of the word just repeats itself like with a hyphen, so ham. So what is that, the linguistic content of that word? Is there a history of translation around that word, maybe along the Islamic tradition? So that would just interest me.
Mm-hmm. So in Senegal, there are different types of wrestling, and now, so far as I learned now, traditional wrestling, lutte avec frappe, that means wrestling with beating, and also Olympic wrestling. And so this is the context, and this means different things, but especially Lutherweg Frapp, there are huge arenas, right? And it's disseminated by television. These are stars. The wrestlers are stars today. But the wrestling itself often plays a small role in these encounters, because you have, for instance, this praise singing, right, as part of it, but also in one of the poems, the amulets came in. So there's also this element of being protected, having substances or talismans to protect you. So it's also competition of these aspects, right? It's not only about like the fight that can take just a minute, and before you had 2 hours of other things going on. Yes, I found this and I think for like the traditional role of wrestling in society, like before also television, I found this very interesting, this collection that I quoted twice. Core is the journal, and it's a special issue, and they engage with it on different ways. And one part is also that Mbër, a champion wrestler, is supposed to be a role model in every sense, right? Not only a great fighter. I think that which is now less the case. And the Mbër has suk, so wrestling apprentices that follow him and live with him as well. So I think in this way one could also dig deeper about the meaning of Mbër and fellowship, right? Ham means to know, right? And that you intensify through reduplication is very common in Wolof, right? There can be different kinds of intensification. So you have legi legi, see you very soon, for instance. Legi legi, very soon. Or, I feel always very conscious of myself when I talk with a Wolof native speaker in place. So ham is the intensification of ham, right? Etymologically, so or like from the
abstraction by iteration. Is it abstraction or is it intensification?
But I would always say, I would say intensification. Now, in contemporary Senegal, ham is often used as science, right? So if people translate science, they often use ham, which you can also read as intensification or abstraction. But for me, the intensification is the major part, but I can think about it and also think about different examples maybe to discuss this, because in Wolof, verbs can also be nouns, by their syntactic function and by adding an article. So I don't think that theoretically the only way to construct a noun of ham, it's not the only way of constructing a noun, it would be to reduplicate.
Thank you, Leo.
Yes, thank you very much, Monika. My first question is connected to what Sul already asked. If we think about philosophy in many contexts, it's often something connected to the elite, to some people who are like privileged in society and who don't have to work for providing for their own sustenance. And I was just thinking, is wrestling part of the traditional aristocratic culture or something? Is it part of a curriculum of how these people were educated, for example? I'm asking this because my second question is there a lot of communication between, for example, Islamic philosophy and the wrestling sport? When I think of the Japanese context, for example, embodiment arts like the martial arts or also no theater, they were part of the curriculum of the samurai class, of the ruling class, kind of. And through this, there was a lot of exchange between monks, samurai, and performers of these arts. They shared a common knowledge system, kind of, and they used the same vocabulary. For example, the martial artist would use Buddhist terminology to describe what they are doing and to describe kind of the highest levels of their own art. And I was just thinking if something like this also happened in the Wolof context, because in the Japanese context you could say that they were trying to perform these teachings. They were trying to find a performative way to show what was written in the texts, kind of. So this is my second question. Mm-hmm. And if I may, a third question, is there some expression for something like mind in the descriptions of wrestling and connected texts? Because again, I'm coming from the Japanese context, there is this expression kokoro, which is mind, or shin, which means heart. So when they conceive of mind, they speak of heart, which is both coming from a Buddhist context, where it's like an abstract concept for mind, and also from the poetic tradition, where it plays a big role in writing poems. Mm. So there's both this kind of abstract knowledge and this kind of engaged emotional connection to the natural world that is both coming into kokoro, and then presenting this kind of model of mind which can be connected to the body very much. And I would be interested if there's some similar concept in the Wolof context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a lot of questions that I can't answer. Maybe just also to give a bit of context, in my doctoral thesis I have not dealt with Mbër. This is really a work in progress and something new. In agreement with Abu Sede, I present here something new. And I find these very interesting pieces of like further exploration. The mind would be hell. And this just means mind. And this is something that reappears in texts alongside things which I would not say it is connected. You have you mentioned the heart before, and heart metaphors in Wolof are very interesting for, like, at least me as a non-native speaker, because so for instance, hol mused, to have a cold heart, means to be calm and happy, and I'm always a bit. I always have to think into it. So these were to your last questions, and I don't know, Usman, I don't think that such a historical connection of Mbër and the intellectual elite existed, or would, like from wrestling as a practice also of the elite as a part of the education?
No, I don't know personally.
Yeah.
But you may know better than I do.
yeah. So yeah, I also, so I don't know. I'd never heard of it. So far I found one text also that Falun Gong pointed me to Mbak. So it's also a praise to Sheikh Ibrahim, and I think what with the Muridiya, the embodied and performative action is really working the fields. That is like their focus. So the Murid way is to work, and there's Sheikh Ibrahim, who was one of the disciples of Ahmadu Bamba, who really put this, he said, well, we don't need to pray, we need to work. Like, work is his spiritual practice. So there would be something where I would think of the embodiment and performative practice. But I'm happy to search further. Thank you for these ideas.
Yeah, thank you. If there's no urgent question, I would like to ask the question, or Jordan first.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. But I had kind of two associations with the wrestling metaphor from your presentation. The first, kind of the coming from the translation angle, and I think I probably read this from George Steiner somewhere, but Jacob wrestling with the angel. And when you kept saying, like, engaging and being transformed, the funny thing about this story is that he ends up having a limp forever because he is left changed by the experience. But on the other hand, the other association in some of the quotes that you shared, then I was thinking again more of like Socrates, that masters were being praised, people who were formidable in their level of knowledge and learning were being compared with the Mbër, as far as I understood. So I wanted to ask, is that, to what extent do you see these two associations, or is the second one correct? And then I just wanted to comment on this one line that struck me that I really liked, and I believe it was from N.J., who said, speaking of Diop, he's so light with people and so heavy with knowledge. So thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing out this being light with people, because this is really a very positive evaluation in Wolof. Like, being pleasant, and to be very light is the direct translation, but it's really how in English you would usually say, well, he's pleasant, I don't know, familiar, gentle with people, right? But I wanted to leave it there because this is really the being light and being heavy in knowledge. This is the play of words that there is, right? And yes, so the masters are praised. I just don't like to put in the word as, because that's the interesting thing, what I said in the end, like, Koch is Mbër, God is Mbër. It's not he is as Mbër, but he takes this place. And this is, I think, very important to keep in this, that it's not a comparison, but an enactment and a reality. So yes, but this was the second, even though I really like where your mind is wandering, wrestling with the angels and having a limp. That would be interesting if there's any explicit notion of what happens if someone, confronts a Mbër and is not ready for it, right?
Yeah, then maybe I have the chance to ask my question.
I'll just hold it here.
Okay. I would like to come back to one of the concepts which you mentioned, and I'm very much interested in, namely listening. I don't know if you can come back to the poem where the term listening is explained or used at least twice. Listening is important for me for two reasons. As one reason is that listening as a capacity comes more into discussion now, again, but actually it has a long history. And in the ancient Egyptian manuscripts, listening is one of the core terms, very important in the context of the concept of Maat. And if we now come back to Cheikh Anta Diop, who has been doing a comparison between ancient Egyptian language and manuscripts and Wolof, and tries to draw a line from the ancient Egyptian cosmology, philosophy, to Wolof, saying that the roots of African philosophy are in Egypt, and we can show it in Wolof. My question is, do you know more about the importance of the concept of listening in Wolof? And then I think on your poem which you used here, there are two meanings of listening, namely listening to refuse, I think is something what is not so good, if I understood it right, but listening to accept is the right way to listen. Now, of course, the question is to accept what, and is it not a kind of obedience, or is it a kind of critical listening?
Yeah, thank you very much for taking this concept of listening very far. So the first thing that came to my mind when I listened to you was in Wolof, you makes a similar distinction as in French, for instance, no, about hearing and understanding. So in French you have écouter et entendre, no, and in Wolof you have, for instance, dégg, hearing, right, and dégg, understanding, right, and you can dégg Wolof, understand Wolof. Right, so you wouldn't say you usually don't say I speak Wolof, but I understand it. So I think there are different, as you said, there are different forms of listening, of different depth, right, as well. No, what does it mean? And you need some training to be able to listen in some cases, be it linguistic skills or maybe understanding a certain discourse. And I find it difficult to answer now what it is in Wolof, because what we are talking about, right? Are we talking about the Islamic system of education? Are we talking about the families in contemporary Senegal? Are we talking about a hierarchical society that Wolof very much was, right? A caste society. And so I think that probably the listening is very, very important, right? But also in the sense of obedience and followership. And this is very direct and outspoken in the Wolofal Sufi tradition, where it's really taking in. One can speak to transform, but it's first listening. It's first understanding and it's following, it's also giving your life, right? Practicing being part of these, for instance, communal labor, right? When you're schooled in an Islamic school, that means often that you can be, your home is the dara, and one of the practices you have to do is also to beg, even if you're from a rich family, right? So this whole idea of submission and obedience is very strong, I would say, in different aspects of Wolof culture. And I'm trying to really understand and take a grasp on it, what it means, because of course, yeah, I come from a different idea, and like all my alarm signs ring when I talk about these things, obedience and followership, giving up everything you have to join a community, for instance. You know, I don't know, this is part of my culture, but of course also personal reflection that I'm just very unfamiliar with this being seen as something absolutely positive. Right? So I think what now happens is, of course, and this is then interesting, coupled with the issue of translation. Because on the one hand, you have this absolute obedience. And then your master tells you, well, you now write in Wolof. So it means it's not copying, right? It's not, for instance, copying the Quran in Arabic. It is translating and thereby also being creative, talking differently. And this, of course, gives you a whole range of transforming also concepts. So I think that's more like the concept as I would see it. Like now, I talked a lot about this Sufi poetry. I didn't include a third poem of the Sheikh Anta Diop praising poems, because there Sheikh Alun Diao, who is one of the most important writers of Wolof expression in contemporary Senegal, he writes about Sheikh Anta Diop having won a fight, or the fight, all the fights, very much as this. And I was like, well, but he hasn't. That's all the point, right? He wasn't acknowledged, especially in his lifetime, for a lot of what he did. And for instance, the Wolof language is still not an official language. We are now more than 60 years after independence. So actually one of his major concerns was to promote African languages, especially Wolof, also not only on a national, but even on a Pan-African level. So zero progress, if you want. And he says, well, he closed the arena, right? It's all decided. So I find this a very interesting tension we are in there. So on the one hand, you have this total submission and also this Sheikh Anta Diop, you are the star, right? On the other hand, it really makes you think about especially Sheikh Alun Diao, who is like his biography is marked by, because he didn't find a publisher for his first novel because it was written in Wolof. So he's very much aware that Sheikh Anta Diop has not won the fight, but it's a certain manner of expressing oneself. And I here mention also Pape Abdou Fall, who is working on, for instance, how in Koch's sayings there are these different levels, and never the first meaning is what is meant, right? There are always these different levels of the philosophical discourse. And so this, in a way, it's also a listening for kinds of obedience that are not evident at first sight, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can talk a little bit more tomorrow in our research talk about it. Last possibility for questions or comments now.
Yeah, thank you, Monika. Just a mixture of comment and question. Back to the point that Leon raised. So I was thinking also on my side, I was thinking about two forms of bodily in engagement in the process of, let's say, thinking. One is the in the mystical circles is sama, or the dance, the ritual dance. We know the most famous one is in Konya, around on the grave of Rumi, but it was sama, was a form of established ritual dance that was related to the experience of ecstasis, but was accompanied by music. And the first thing I was just referring to is that if you see something parallel to that in the, for example, traditions of Sufis in Senegal, for example, music and especially sama. And secondly, the physical travel and also the metaphoric meaning of the travel is very important. On one side, this established form of pilgrimage to Mecca, but to the saint places, but also to visit a master is very important. That, for example, established, for example, mystical figure is living, for example, in Baghdad, and someone from Isfahan takes this time and goes there, and this travel is on the physical level something very important in this process of getting to know also yourself, but also on the metaphorical level. And it is there is a whole literature on the meaning of this travel, which is also a transformation in itself. And also, again, if you see a parallelity with that, there was two forms of bodily involvement I was thinking about. Yeah.
So what I couldn't show you was that, of course, poetry is sung, right? So this, or what we would say singing, like it's performed.
Yeah.
And the word "voi" in Wolof can be both translated as poem and song in English. And yes, so I know, for instance, for the Beifall, they sing at least on Thursday nights in many places, and perform it. And in the pilgrimage, they are also performing things that can be called dances, but I think the most vivid example is the Layen community or the Layen Brotherhood in Senegal, which have very much also like these repetitive movements, which I think you may be thinking of in Sufi dancing, right? To also elevate yourself, right, to a certain state of body and mind. So yes, exists very much. Yes, and then you talked about the traveling and the meaning of a travel, and yeah, that I wanted to say part of this, I think, which is interesting, of course, with the first comment by Usman about this relation to Mauritania, because this is also a place where you could go to study, and there's a kind of like negative portrayal of Mauritania in this specific poem because of the exile, which is some kind of anti-narration to it. And we might want to ask Islamic scholars when they come here who are experts on Senegal, how the different, for instance, brotherhood also envision this travel versus stability, because yes, travel, intellectual travel, but then you also have this aspect of work, which was working the fields, groundnut production, which also means to be stable, right? So I think there might be also different narratives of traveling and being in some way in one place, but working there as different narratives, but also, of course, different hierarchies of practicing Sufi Islam. Yeah, but thank you very much for this comment, which of course leads back to the idea of Hajj as also a learning experience that we discussed yesterday. Yeah.
Good. Maybe last remark from my side. If I understand your argument right, you say that praise poetry can be seen as part of philosophy. Is philosophy?
No, it can be philosophy. It doesn't have to be, but I think we would be quick to exclude it from philosophy.
Because I think a good part of the literature of philosophy in the European tradition is a kind of praise poetry, starting with praising the ancient Greek philosophers up to our heroes, Hegel and Kant. So I think praise poetry is part of philosophy. Thank you so much for your lecture. We will continue discussing more points which you raised here in your presentation today, tomorrow at 10 o'clock in our research talk in our Center for Advanced Studies. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking all your questions. Next Thursday is no lecture because it is an official feast day here in Germany. And in 2 weeks, I think we will welcome here then, I think, Amr El-Hawari, if I'm right. Amr El-Hawari, who will talk about philosophy in Egypt, in Egyptian, ancient Egyptian manuscripts. So we would be happy to see you then in 2 weeks here again. Thank you so much and have a nice evening.